covered a lot of topics related to putting together your permit to install application, and now we're going to talk about what happens after you submit your application to the Air Quality Division. So here we have an outline of the overall permitting process, and we'll keep coming back to this as we walk through these various steps. Some of the steps in the permitting process might take longer than others, and it all depends on the project scope. It depends on how complete the application is when we receive it, and it depends on our workload in the permit section and a few other factors. So, you know, for very simple applications where we have all the information we need up front, lately we've been pretty busy. So even with those, it's probably typically taking a couple months to get your permit application. With very large, complex projects that could involve public comment, for instance, those projects could take as long as 240 days or even more. That's kind of one of our deadlines in the rule. So the most significant thing that you can do to ensure your application review process moves smoothly is to try to submit a complete application up front. And if we have questions for you and we request additional information, try to respond as completely and timely to those requests as possible. So with that, let's get started talking about the permit screening process. When the AQD permit section receives an application, we follow a two-part screening process. The goal is to try to identify any issues with your application as early as possible to save everyone time in the long run. We follow a checklist when we do this, which you can find online, and we have the link here for your future reference. The first part of our screening process is administrative. Once we receive an application, an AQD screener checks for whether the permit form is filled out completely. They check to make sure we have at least one copy with an original signature. They make sure that there is supporting information attached. And they check to make sure we have all the copies that we need, and information and instructions about that are in the back of the form. It also tells you where to send the form on the back of the application form. So if we decide we have all the basic information in the administrative screening, we'll move on to the more technical screening, where a permit engineer will sit down and look through your application from a more technical standpoint to determine if there are any initial concerns with the project. And things we look for at this stage include basic emission calculations and emission rates are listed, including things like toxic air contaminants. A toxics analysis is provided if applicable. The process description makes sense. The stacks are described and it is clear which equipment vents to which stacks. Stack parameters are provided, and Jeff went over those, and they're also listed in the instructions on the back of the form. We check to make sure that there's a site description, or at least that we can understand how the site is laid out, whether that's through a site plan, showing all the buildings, the property line, and other emission points at the facility. And we check to make sure you've addressed applicable requirements. So this screening process helps us decide what to do next with your application. If the application looks complete, then we will formally accept the application. If it looks mostly complete, but there's a few missing items, then we'll accept the application and we'll follow up with you, likely in an email requesting the additional information that we need. If the application is missing some key important information, but we think you would probably be able to put it together within a couple weeks, we will put the application on hold in what we call offline tracking, and we'll send you a letter requesting the missing information with a deadline of 2 weeks. And if you submit the information by the deadline, then we'll accept your application, and if not, we will send the application back to you so that you can spend as much time as you need to get it together and resubmit it. And then the last option is if we receive an application with severe deficiencies that prevent us from really doing any type of review, then we will return it to you with a letter explaining why. Just please keep in mind, if you happen to have an application sent back to you, that in no way prevents you from submitting another, hopefully complete application in the future. All right, so once we get past application screening, the application would be assigned to a permit engineer and it would receive an application number. Our application numbers look like this. They start with APP for application, followed by the year the application was received, and then a 4-digit number, and this is just corresponds with the order the application number was assigned. So in this example, this would be the 3rd application that we received and assigned a number to in 2021. The next step in the process would be the technical review, and this is likely the longest stage of the application review process. During the technical review, the permit engineer will verify the potential emission calculations for the facility. They will review all the regulatory applicability, for the project, including looking at Michigan air pollution control rules and federal air regulations to determine all applicable rules and their requirements. So there is often a lot of back and forth between the permit engineer and the applicant at this stage. The permit engineer might call the applicant with questions to make sure that they understand the process, or they might send emails or letters requesting more information with deadlines for the applicant to get back to us. You can think of the permit engineer, or we like to think of the permit engineer as the project manager for each permit application, but they're not the only ones involved in reviewing the application. We almost always have a peer reviewer assigned to each application, and they are another permit engineer who helps with the review. If you submit air dispersion modeling, or if we determine that your application needs to have air dispersion modeling, then we'll work with our in-house experts on that. If your project involves emissions of air toxics, often we will consult with AQD's toxicologist on the proposed emissions. And to get a better understanding of the history and the existing operations at the facility, we will often consult with your assigned AQD inspector, and they also review the draft conditions too. And of course, you, the applicant, are involved in this process as well. The faster you can get back to us with accurate, complete information when we ask for it, the faster the review will go. All right, let's talk about draft permit conditions. The permit engineer is responsible for drafting your permit based on the information in your application and on the technical review that was performed. Sometimes the engineer might send you preliminary draft conditions before the draft has gone through any kind of internal review. And those are just to kind of give you an idea of what your conditions are going to look like, so that you can raise any concerns early in the process. Often we jump straight to what we call the final draft conditions though. And what those are is they've been looked at by a peer reviewer and we received comments and worked on those. They've also been reviewed by the AQD district inspector that's assigned to your facility. And once the conditions are agreed upon internally by AQD, then they will be sent to you, the applicant. And at this stage, I really want to emphasize that it's extremely important that you carefully read through the permit conditions to make sure that all the equipment descriptions are accurate, make sure that your company can actually comply with those permit conditions, because now is your chance to raise any concerns that you have. We typically give you 14 days to provide comments on the draft conditions, and you can ask for more time if you need it. At this point, you should point out any errors, inconsistencies, or areas of concern. Generally, we ask for you to provide comments in writing for us, but we can also have a conference call as needed to discuss the conditions. At this point in the process, one of 3 actions can be taken. The first is if the applicant agrees to the conditions and the application does not require public comment, then a permit decision can be made. And at this point in the process, unless we came up with some huge red flag at the very end, then the decision will be an approval, because we won't write up a draft permit and send you draft conditions unless we think that the permit can be approved. The second option is if you agree to the conditions and the application requires public notice, then the draft conditions will go through the public notice process, which we will talk about in the next few slides. Or lastly, if the applicant and AQD cannot come to an agreement, or if the applicant decides not to move forward with the project, or if they decide to withdraw their application for any reason, then the application could be voided at this point. At any point during the various stages of review with the draft conditions, those conditions could change depending on comments and input that's received. Sometimes when we're at this final stage where we send the conditions to the applicant finds a few things that are missing or wrong, or they give us new information that cause us to have to revisit the technical review at this point. So there can be some looping back to earlier steps in the process sometimes. All right, let's talk more about public notice. This is found in Rule 205 of the Air Pollution Control Rules, and all the requirements regarding public notice are there. An application will go through public notice if it is subject to major new source review. That would include PSD or non-attainment new source review. If it is using a specific method called netting to avoid PSD or non-attainment new source review. For permits that are accepting emission limitations that are 90% or more of any major source threshold. For applications with significant public interest, or what might be called a controversial source, and for new major sources of hazardous air pollutants. And we try to make the determination about whether an application needs public notice early on in the process so that we can let you know right away, so that you're not surprised by this at the last minute. This is a workshop aimed at minor sources and first-time applicants, but we'll just talk about public notice a little bit. When we do public notice, we publish it in a newspaper that's close to the facility and on our website. The application is required to go through at least 30 days of public comment. During this time, the public can submit comments via phone, email, letter, or they could request that a hearing be held so that they can submit comments in person. And sometimes we will schedule a hearing right up front if we know that there's enough interest. After the hearing, if held, and after the comment period, then a permit decision will be made. And there is a designated decision maker within the AQD, and they'll decide whether to approve the permit with no changes, just as drafted, or approve it with some changes based on the comments that were received, or to deny the application. All right, so we're on to the last step, which we just sort of talked about, the permit decision. If a permit is, or if an application is approved and going to become a permit, it's designated with a permit number. And these consist of 2 sets of numbers separated by a dash, like our example here, 176-20. If this permit was for new equipment, or if the facility didn't already have a permit, it would get a brand new permit number like this. And basically 176 corresponds with, it's the 176th new permit number that was issued in the year 2020. So the 20 stands for the year. But if a company had this permit and then they came back to modify that permit, then we would add a letter as a suffix to that. So the new permit would be named 176-20A. And if they got another modification, it would be 176-20B, and so on. Once the permit is approved, we will send you those draft conditions and an email telling you that it's approved right away. And then in the snail mail, you will receive the official copy of your permit and all the conditions, and a letter explaining that it's been approved with our contact information there. So that's why we're highlighting this. If you ever have any questions about your permit after this point, you have our contact information and you can always call us up. And from this point on, it's your job to make sure you can comply with those permit conditions.